when the bicycle came to Vermont. This is a talk with Luis Vivanco. We extend our thanks to our partners at Vermont Humanities, as well as to the generous underwriters who made it possible for us to offer such a rich and robust program. The sponsor of our entire First Wednesday season is the Vermont Department of Libraries and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And today's event is underwritten by Wilmington, Campbell, Bent, and Stadney, PC. Tonight we come together from across the state to listen, to learn, and to be inspired in community. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items. Please make sure that you check in for the event. We do value your support, and the data for this data is used for reporting the success of the program to local and state national supporters of our events. And a few internal housekeeping events, just to let you know, this Friday at 5 o'clock, we have Level 3 and Invisible Mountain Brewing Companies coming along with Avocado Pit in order to be able to celebrate Cinco de Mayo. Also have a local musician, Mark Harding, coming. So it should be a fun evening here at the library Friday night. On Saturday, an all-day event, we have our Spring Spectacular Family Fun Day. So if you have anybody who is interested perhaps in learning how to be a circus performer, we have Troy Wetterly coming to the library. It's a big top workshop. I also have Trish Whale, who is coming in to do a fiber arts workshop. We will have food for sale from Willoughby's as well as the Crooked Bar Charcuterie. So please do find your way in on Saturday if you have the time available. I'm also going to let you know that next Thursday evening, we have Dave Cannell and Erica Housekeeper who are coming to talk about exploring Vermont cities, towns, and places. That talk is going to be at 5:30, and it's going to be focusing on the 251 Club, exploring Vermont, and finding ways to be connected with the places that we visit. Also, an important event I would like to tell you about is on Saturday, May 20th, we are having another quarterly town hall conversation. So join Executive Director Ed Surgeon and members of the Board of Trustees. You're going to get to learn about what's been going on in the library and what's on the horizon. There's going to be a short 10 to 15 minute presentation talking about how MCL compares with other libraries in Vermont, and then you'll have a chance to ask questions and give your feedback. We look forward to having you join us. And last but not least, I want to let you know that on Thursday, June 15th, we are thrilled to announce that at 5 p.m., the critically acclaimed author Chris Bojalian is going to be joining us as our guest speaker in conversation with WAMC Northeast Public Radio's Joe Donahue for this year's fundraiser and silent auction. Chris is going to share his insights into his remarkable literary journey and discuss his novels. This fun-filled night will also include delicious food, beverages, and incredible auction items. So reserve your tickets now at the front desk, online, or on our website. And it is now my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker. Luis Vivanco is a professor of anthropology and the chair of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Vermont. He studied religion at Dartmouth and received his PhD in cultural anthropology from Princeton. He researches environmental social movements in Costa Rica, Mexico, Colombia, and the U.S., the history of wildlife films, and the urban bicycle use. It's quite the eclectic combination.
Defines me as an anthropologist.
Luis is a recipient of UVM's Kidder Outstanding Faculty Award for excellence in teaching, mentoring, and an ability to inspire students for lifelong learning. So please join me in welcoming Luis Vivanco for this evening's talk.
Thank you all. Really excited to be here. And to add to that list of eccentric things, I'm also a board member of Vermont Humanities, and I just want to make a plug for this community's long-standing support for Vermont Humanities First Wednesday series. I've come down here over the years to sort of introduce speakers in this series, but I've never actually been invited to give my talk, and so I'm really excited. So I am a cultural anthropologist. Yes, we are eclectic in our interests, but writ broadly, I'm a social movement scholar, and I've looked at sustainability-focused movements, and at one point, maybe 12, 13 years ago, a friend and colleague up at UVM who worked in our Transportation Research Center invited me for coffee and said, you know, we are trying to build a community of scholars working on bicycle transportation, and we thought maybe you would be interested in that because we see you on a bike all the time. And so I kind of scratched my head, and it struck me that something had changed in how I was viewed, I think, as a bike rider since I was a kid, which was, at some point, it became a green activity. It was this idea that the bicycle is a vehicle for a small planet. And that kind of struck me as I walked away from this, what I felt a rather perplexing meeting. I was like, bicycle transportation, what would that look like as an anthropologist? And I thought, well, let me go look it up. Maybe there's something in the scholarship, and I might be able to get a sense. I was not by any stretch committed to any of this yet. But I looked and I looked and I looked, and there was nothing. And that opened up my horizon tremendously, because I thought, well, what would it look like to create an anthropology of bicycles and bicycling? And especially using this hook of being a scholar of environmental movements, what's the relationship between sustainability and bicycles? So that has led me down lots of fun rabbit holes. But one of the things that I did was I wrote a book. And the book, Reconsidering the Bicycle, is sort of my effort at creating and describing and theorizing the relationship between culture, politics, and bicycles. And in that book, I was bringing in some of my ethnographic research, fieldwork. And among other places, I was doing fieldwork in Bogota, Colombia, a really interesting city where bike politics is really intense, but also prioritized. Bicycles there are given tremendous space in the urban infrastructure. And I was also doing fieldwork in Burlington, because there was some shift, a detectable shift in Burlington about, let's say, 15 years ago, where suddenly the city is talking about trying to make the city friendlier for bicycle use as part of its broader zero emissions kinds of initiatives. So I was doing fieldwork in Burlington, and I knew in the back of my head from readings that I've been doing that there was a bike craze in the 1890s that really took the United States and a number of European countries by storm. And so I naively wanted to tell a little bit of that history in this book before I got into the contemporary dynamics playing out in Burlington. And when I went to the library at Special Collections at UVM, there's a librarian there, Prudence Doherty, who's used to own a bike shop. Her son's a bike mechanic, like she's a bicyclist. And she's like, Luis, you're going to have to do it all your own, because there's nothing. But it's all there. She's like, it's just scattered. And so I threw myself into city directories and different aldermen's reports over the last century, and newspapers. The newspapers have been digitized recently, so I could do searches on old Vermont newspapers, looking at photo collections and looking at diaries. And what I got was enough to put into my book in maybe a page before I got to what I thought was the really cool stuff, which is what's happening now. But there was such cool stuff in that history that no one had told, that I thought I need to do more with that. And so I developed this talk, and I developed a bicycle history bike tour of Burlington. So if you're ever up there and you want to do it, just let me know. Take you on it. It's a 9-mile ride around to different spots where I can show you fun photos and talk about the bike history of that city. But then I got so hungry to know more, and I started expanding my attention around the state, going to archives at the state level and in different towns, and what I have is a total mountain of material. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, sort of pull out some of the big, interesting themes. And I have already encountered a few bike nuts in the room, but if you're not a bike nut, I can reassure you, you don't have to be one of us to really enjoy this talk, because as an anthropologist, I think of bicycles as a lens. They're an entry point into some deeper, bigger changes that were happening at the turn of the century that are really consequential, and I'll explain what I mean by that as we go. But before we dive in, I want to just introduce you to the sort of 4 major prominent bicycle types. You'll see in that little comic guide to this talk, which you can take with you or leave behind, there's a field guide to 19th century bicycles. And I'll just touch on each of these briefly to give you a sense, because we're going to talk about 3 of these and their role in Vermont history. So the Draisine is the first sort of recognized version of a bicycle. It's really a running machine. It doesn't have pedals or cranks or anything. It was thought to, or it was intended to be a horse replacement because that year without summer, which affected Vermont, this was in 1815, 1816, that led to major die-offs of horses, and a guy named Karl von Drais, a German nobleman in northern Germany, had always wanted to invent a horseless carriage, and he saw these horses dying. He said, I need to create a replacement for the horse. So he creates this Draisine, sometimes called a velocipede, and you would run on it, and its steering was very rudimentary. It became popular among upper crust Parisians and Londoners and New Yorkers, and they were called dandy chargers because they were associated with dandies. But it was a real sort of fad that came and went throughout the 19th century, and then the story goes that in the 1860s in a Paris wagon wheel shop of the Michaud brothers, there was an old Draisine shows up, and somebody, there's a big historical debate about who did it, but that involved patent wars between the individuals involved. But somebody apparently puts a crank and some pedals on that front wheel and creates what was known as a velocipede, but more popularly the bone shaker. These things are quite heavy, approaching this 80 to 90, 100 pounds. Wagon wheels. They did have solid rubber tires, but they were called bone shakers because you can imagine how, riding on cobblestone streets you would get shaken really to the bones. And the first use of the word bicycle, by the way, is associated with that object. People want to go faster, and so the way you make things faster on a direct drive vehicle is you grow that front wheel. And so we see the 3rd type, the high wheeler or the ordinary, the penny farthing, grow. And this is a moment of great technological innovation in England for the most part initially, and then it really spreads to the United States. But we have the creation of spoked wheels at this time, so wheels that are based on tension to hold them together. Steel tubing is being used and bent, and these bicycles were incredible, lightweight, 20 pounds, 23 pounds, something like that. And the remarkable feats of human endurance were achieved on these, including the first ride around the world by a guy named Thomas Stevens, who came to Vermont, actually, to give his talk about his great trip. So he basically just started on the West Coast and headed east and got on ships. And there's lots of incredible stories of how he skirted death as he was riding across trestle bridges when trains are coming, and he would get off and hang down with his bike. And so pretty amazing. But these are obviously very dangerous bikes. The term header comes about because you hit something too hard, you're going to fly over the front potentially and kill yourself or get severely injured. So one of the key contributors to that technology of the high wheeler, a guy named James Starling, looking to make this a safer bicycle, comes up with this idea of the safety bicycle. That's basically the form of bicycle you more or less see today. You see the chain drive, 2 equally sized wheels, and Dr. Dunlop, an Irish physician, adds the pneumatic tires, so we go from solid tires to pneumatic tires to soften the ride, and that bicycle really just takes off. And you'll see the last 3 of these bicycles starting right now, because there was a velocipede craze in Vermont. These are images from St. Albans. There was a velocipede riding school up in St. Albans in the Darrow Concert Hall in 1869. And there were reports of velocipede parades up there. Here's a three-wheeled velocipede, women's velocipede. Montpelier had velocipedes. There was a velocipede manufacturer in what is now Berlin, making children's velocipedes. That played an interesting, conspicuous role in the big patent fight in the history of bicycles and brought some fame to Vermont for a short time for its manufacturing of velocipedes. It was maybe notorious fame. But these were pretty rare. You might say that this velocipede craze was a real flash in the pan. And we don't see much bicycling activity on any scale until the 1880s, when you have the high-wheelers becoming more common. And at this time, these were known as wheels, the wheel, and it generated enormous curiosity and excitement, although it was a very expensive bicycle, over a month's wages for the typical worker. And wealthy men, including Nellie Ross here, whose father was the president of the Lincoln Iron Works in Rutland, created wheelmen's clubs and dressed up in uniforms and had elaborate emblems, and they would organize themselves into proper riding position, which was a kind of a cavalry style riding, with the captain at the front and the bugler calling out moves, and they would ride all over the countryside. They would make runs and draw a lot of attention to themselves. They liked skating rinks. Skating rinks were a popular place for these bikes to be ridden because they could do tricks on them. And skating rinks were a pretty safe place to learn. So wheelmen's clubs were often closely associated with ice skating rinks, which they sometimes purchased or had built themselves. As we get into the 1890s, that safety bicycle becomes much more available, and this is what is known as the first bicycle boom, or the bicycle craze is what they called it sometimes back then. And these bikes are obviously becoming safer. Women are taking to the wheel. Lower prices are really making these more available to middle class and sort of aspiring middle class people. Roads were beginning to improve thanks to pressure from wheelmen who took it on as a major political project to fix bad roads. And retailers of all kinds who sold were selling bicycles, and they were drawing in buyers with all kinds of novel techniques of selling, segmenting the market and picking a particular body type, for example, and some selling certain accessories to certain audiences and so on. And in Burlington, for example, we had, over the course of that decade of the 1890s, we had 10 different retailers of bicycles, which is a really remarkable fact, given that today our city is 43,000 or so. Back then it was about 19, 20,000, and today we have 4, maybe a 5th bike shop, but they had 10 over the course of that decade. And everyone was getting in on the act. The Lane's bicycle livery here, this one, was the only really truly solely dedicated to bicycle shop. They held bike auctions. You could rent a bike there as a short-term visitor. They sold huge quantities of bikes, but they were the only real sole bike shop. It was others selling other things that got in. They became agents for bicycle manufacturers. So George Hager had a hardware store and was selling harness trimmings and such. but he was also selling Victor and New bicycles. L.M. March, who was a jeweler on Church Street, was selling diamond watches, clocks, and jewelry, but also had an optical goods and bicycles department. And then the electrical supply house of P.H. Vancouver, selling electrical construction equipment of every description, did have a bicycle department too, containing some of the most popular bicycles on the market. And so it was a real bicycle mania, and it was understood to be that back then. This is a wonderful comic. This is a British version of the comic. I don't have a copy of the American version, but it's very similar. From 1897. The latest disease, bicycle mania, we all have it. And it's just so much fun to look at all of the detailed signs here, where there was so much excitement and prestige associated with bicycles that everybody retailing other things wanted to be part of it and associate their products with bicycles, right? So, and this is obviously satirizing that, but you know, is Rocket Hall, drink bicycle soda, buy the roulette wheel, bicycle tonic, cures bicyclist diseases. I'll talk a bit about the weird bicyclist diseases. I'll just say one of them, just to whet your appetite, was bicycle face. And that was a very feared and targeted diagnosis, especially by women. And it was, you could get it several ways. One was you were too furious a rider, which meant that you were so excited for speed that you would be so crunched over and your face would get stuck in a contortion from the excitement, right? Or it would happen because of the struggle to hold a bicycle in balance, right? And so your face would get stuck. And it was actually targeted at women who were starting to use bicycles more in the 1890s and exercise their autonomy and ride around unchaperoned and so on. So male doctors were like, you're going to get bicycle face, right? As an indirect way to dissuade them from riding bicycles. But this bicycle mania was really huge. And what's interesting is that by 1905, here in Vermont, it really begins to diminish. And a lot of it had to do with changes in the bicycle industry. There was a lot of overproduction. You know, the automobile is just beginning to emerge. You start seeing stories about so-called locomobiles, which are steam-powered automobiles, in the newspapers. And, you know, that locus of excitement that was focused on bicycles really starts to shift towards the automobile a bit. But here's the thing. It was not just a passing fad. And it really was closely related to and precipitated some durable changes that we take for granted today. And I can think of no better one than the idea of automobility and the joys of effortless speed. So automobility, this idea that you can just sort of direct yourself and under your own power go somewhere, was a new and very novel experience for people. Of course, they could go fast on trains and horses, but horses get tired, they need to be fed. Trains are someone else's schedule. There was a sense that trains would swallow you up, whereas bicycles would liberate you, and so you could have this joyful experience that we all know, right, of going fast and not putting in much effort. And people became really fascinated with that. And of course, we take that for granted today. I had a wonderful experience of effortless speed south of Rutland on my way into, you know, this town. It's just a beautiful drive, and I'm going fast. What better thing for an American to dream of, right? But this is born in this time, thanks to the bicycle. It was also a cutting-edge industry. It laid the industrial groundwork for the automobile's rise, and every bicycle manufacturer, Columbia Bicycles is a great example, by the mid-1890s was beginning to plan for putting motors on these things and creating what would become the automobile. And I can think of no more interesting, or let's say suggestive, version of this than the fact that Henry Ford, you may know, was a bicycle mechanic. before he, went off and created the Ford Motor Company. But one of the things that Henry Ford did was he went on a junket. And it was a junket to Hartford, Connecticut, where the Columbia bicycle manufacturing facility was. And that was a cutting-edge industrial facility that was basically doing assembly line production, electrified, 24/7. And it was Thomas Edison who had sort of set this all up, right? So that they could produce just, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bicycles non-stop. And you can imagine, a young Henry Ford remembered that, right? He remembered that, the power of that industrial system that was put into place. And we give him a lot of credit for assembly line production, which he refined, but most bicycle historians say, well, he got the idea in some shape or form at the Hartford factory, the most exciting bicycle factory at the time. Consumer markets were roiled by the bicycle. Really interesting element of late 19th century newspapers, for example, is seeing how many bicycle ads there are. And at one point, at the height of the bicycle craze, about 10% of ads in any newspaper were bicycle related. What this did was this generated so much income for the newspapers that they took the risk of shifting from subscriber-driven funding to advertising-driven funding. So there was a bicycle industry that was behind that. There was a real reordering of gender relations, of women are taking to the wheel, and initially demanding less restrictive clothing, and then increasingly connecting it to political rights, like right to the vote. And it's generating all these new ideas about athleticism and how to use your body and how to use your leisure time, how to escape dirty cities, and go see the landscapes. And so Vermont becomes a destination. The White Mountains of New Hampshire become destinations for what one bike historian, a colleague of mine at UVM, Bob McCullough, calls landscapes. This idea that people were going out, and they were going out with cameras, and so cameras and bicycles are emerging around the same time. And the wheelmen are bringing their cameras and they're taking pictures of landscapes. And they're cultivating certain kinds of sensibilities for landscape appreciation. And they're pushing their bodies. They're trying to see what can they do with these things. So there's a lot of interest in sort of records and doing crazy things on bikes. But it also causes a lot of commotion and social conflict. And some bicyclists are using their wheels in ways that are challenging urban propriety. They're riding on sidewalks and creating a tremendous amount of anger with horse owners. And so traffic laws have to be created. Traffic laws we take for granted today, and ordinances are created to constrain bicycle use. There's a real class dimension I'll get into of this, where sort of elites and working class people have different relationships with the bicycle. It creates tension. And bicycles were drawn into debates over the effects of urbanization on people's lives. And religious leaders especially were decrying bicycle riding on Sundays because people would rather go ride a bicycle than come to church. There was a church in Indiana where the preacher there, he created ride-in services as a way to kind of beat them to it. But Charlotte Smith, who was the president of the Women's Rescue League, was especially concerned about the immorality of bicycling for women. And she's quoted, I'm just quoting her, this is really fantastic. She was referring to one religious leader and had created a bicycle run for Christ as a way to kind of get people to come to church but with their bikes. So this is what Charlotte Smith says. The bicycle run for Christ by so-called Christians should be properly termed bicycle run for Satan. For the bicycle is the devil's advance agent, morally and physically, in thousands of instances. And health authorities are warning of all these maladies like bicycle face and bicycle foot and kyphosis spiciculostarum, which is a hunchback. And so, very controversial at the same time that people are really excited for this. So in this talk, I want to talk about Vermont's experience of all this, and I'm asking questions like, who was riding bicycles? Why were they riding bicycles? Where were they going? What was it like to move around on a bicycle? Where would you go to get it repaired? Where would you buy it? Where would you get parts? What were the roads like? What was the experience like with your friends riding bicycles? So there's three themes around which I organize this talk: the wheelman, new woman, and good roads. So let's get started with the wheelman. So until the turn of the century, wheeling was really viewed as an activity that you would best conduct in lively companionship with your peers. And it was a very ordered activity. It was also very, very much seen as leisure activity and recreation. And given the high cost of bicycles in the early years, it was largely the wealthy who were attracted to bicycles. And they were also joiners, and so they created wheelmen's clubs. And so here's an image of the Swanton, the Bicycle Club of Swanton from 1893. This is the early years of the bicycle craze when the bicycle became more accessible. And these are, I've sort of looked into who these people are, and they were largely clerks and retail salesmen and so on in the town of Swanton. They were not the grandees of Swanton per se, because the bike was becoming much more accessible at that point. But the first wheelmen's clubs were founded in the early 1880s when it was the high wheeler era, and these wheel clubs, including, not just including, but really focus on the Vermont Wheel Club because it was a very prominent one. It was probably the most prominent wheelmen's club in the state. You didn't even have to own a bicycle to join this club. You had to be an upstanding citizen, male citizen, and they did more than bicycle riding. They were renowned for bicycle racing. They sent teams to many races. They would hold races. They would attract thousands. They had a clubhouse that had their, you can see an image there, the sitting room. They would host visiting wheelmen who were passing through. And they had that wonderful emblem there, that symbol of the winged wheel. The winged wheel is a common symbol associated with bicycles throughout the first 20 to 30 years of the bicycle. And they're specially imprinted plates, china, and silverware and so on had that on there. And very elegant. These were wealthy men for the most part. And in Burlington, we had a wheel club. This is called the Burlington Wheel Club, and they were formed in 1886, and they didn't last long. Because in 1887, the Lake Champlain Yacht Club gets established. And all these guys abandon their bicycles and go get yachts. And it says something important about the status symbol that the high wheel bicycle was. It was expensive, it was very difficult to master. You had to have what they called athleticism to really master it, which meant you had to have time. And so the way that the Burlington guys just chose to show their distinction was to go get nice big yachts on the lake. And so we kind of have this quiet time in Burlington of no real wheel clubs until the bike craze picks up. But here's a portrait of a wheelman from Burlington. This is Joseph Auld. He was the president of that club. It was in that last image. And he was a publisher of the Burlington Free Press, a very prominent citizen. He wrote a book, a very well-known book up there called Picturesque Burlington in 1893, which describes a lot of lovely rides, or I should say strolls, to take, to ways to explore the beauty of Burlington and the lakefront surroundings. It barely mentions bicycles, but Auld was a bicyclist, and so he had this sort of landscape appreciation deep in his sense of self, and so he writes this book to sort of encourage it among others, especially visitors coming to Burlington. He was also a tinkerer, and a lot of these early folks involved with bicycles were messing around with them. They were adding things, they were taking things aside. They're adding motors, internal combustion motors in the 1880s. figuring out a way to attach it to a bike. And so he was a tinkerer, and he got a patent for a gearing system on a tricycle. Best I can tell, it never went into production. But you know, this is the type who might be an early wheelman. I'll just give you a quick tour around the state. Not all the wheel clubs. There were dozens of wheel clubs in Vermont, but a few of the more active ones. And Mount Kilburn Wheel Club, which was in Bellows Falls, so not far up the road from Brattleboro, where the Vermont Wheel Club was. And the president of this club during the 1890s was a lawyer, and as a lawyer, he really loved to throw themed events and parties that, like this mock trial, where in this case, this was going to deal with a situation of a larceny of a Plymouth Rock rooster. And so invite the wheelmen, invite their wives and others, and women couldn't necessarily see trials, and so it was seen as an educational affair. But, you know, they would host concerts and balls. They were really the center of the community, in the same way that the Vermont Wheel Club was as well. If, you know, aspiring politicians would trek to these concerts and balls to glad hand and be seen and so on, because these are the elites of the town. So you wanted to kind of cultivate relationships. So you were very attentive to when the wheel clubs were having their gatherings. The Upper Valley was another area of a lot of wheeling activity. And this image here refers to an 1895 bicycle parade. So they took a picture of this bicycle parade, and I found an article about it. There was a lot of clubs in the area, and they came in for this bicycle parade. Sometimes clubs would attract bicycle parades in Woodstock, for example, would attract as many as 500 riders. This one, I want to read for you what it says here, because it's really quite remarkable to imagine. So, a bicycle meet and parade under the auspices of the Wabino Cycle Club was held at Woodstock last Friday afternoon and evening, and was a brilliant and successful affair. Stores and residences were elaborately decorated, and in the evening the entire village was beautifully illuminated by over 3,000 Japanese lanterns. The Hartford and Lebanon cycle clubs and cyclists from adjoining towns were present. The Woodstock Railway Company running a special train. About 200 wheels were in line, and the parade was witnessed by several thousand people. There was a fine display of fireworks in the evening. Woodstock Hornet Band discoursed music and refreshments were served to all cyclists and visiting friends in the town hall. So, everyone came out for these things. Thousands of people would want to see this spectacle of these bicycles under the Japanese lanterns. And I'll just make one little side comment about the Woodstock Railway. So one of the ways that you, as a wheelman, got around the state was by rail. So in the 1840s, we really began seeing our rail system being built out. And by the 1880s, it's in every county, there's train access. And so wheelmen would get their bikes on the train and go visit with their friends several towns away or the other part of the state. There was a big political push to get the state to pass a law that would prevent the train companies from charging baggage fees for bicycles. And they failed in the Vermont Senate, but the railway companies knew better, and they did not charge baggage for bicycles. So you can think about today, right? We fought long and hard with Amtrak to allow us to get our bicycles on Amtrak. So many things, I hope you'll eventually start picking up on this, so many things that we kind of take for granted today that we struggle with as bicycle riders, they were struggling with too, and in many cases figured out ways to pressure or to get things done in their favor. Another side of the whole Woodstock story, Upper Valley story, is kind of starts with this sort of nondescript image. This is just an image of a house on North Park Street in Woodstock around 1900. But if you look at this carefully, this is, by the way, an image from my friend Glenn Hughes, who pointed this out to me. If you look at this carefully in the background, it's a very odd first bicycle to ride down Mount Washington was on one of these things. But the connection to Woodstock is kind of interesting. Oh, and by the way, there was a song. This was such a popular thing that a song was written about the Star Rider. But what's interesting is this little tidbit here, H.B. Smith Machine Company. So, and based in Smithville, Burlington County, New Jersey. So H.B. Smith was born and raised in Woodstock, Vermont. And he created a business in Woodstock that was machines that would help in the manufacture of wood products. And it became very successful, and his ambition was more than just sort of spending his life in Woodstock doing this. And so he went to New Jersey and he basically bought a township in Burlington County and created a kind of a company, town of sorts there, where he was manufacturing wood processing equipment. And one day, a guy shows up with this design of this Star Rider and says, I think you have the precision manufacturing equipment to help you make these things. Would you like to go in with me on this business? So H.B. Smith had a lot of, he could see the open horizons of excitement around the bicycle, so he said, sure. And so they went into business together. And this bicycle really was considered to be the Mercedes of bicycles for a few years. It was very expensive. It was seen to be, you know, the fastest, the safest bike you could get a hold of. And so there was a lot of prestige associated with this particular bicycle. In Rutland, they had one of the very first wheelmen's clubs in Vermont. They founded in 1881. And as I said earlier, skating rinks and wheelmen were closely associated. And in this case, the wheel club in Rutland decided to build a skating rink. And so they put in a lot of money and effort. They opened it on July 4th, 1884. It cost $15,000, and it was, in today's money, that's about $420,000 or so. So it was not insubstantial, but it was quite remarkable. It was considered to be one of the finest skating rinks in New England. It had 1,200 seats. I think it was 800 on the floor, another 400 up above. And they had chandeliers and gas jets. But this is like for the 2 or 3 people like Glenn Ames and myself who are interested in this stuff. There was always a mystery around this thing, because in 1885, the year after it opens, it gets auctioned off for $2,325. So something dramatic happened. So I put myself to the task of trying to figure out what went on here. And it was rather mundane but very consequential. It led to the disbanding of this club. They were so devastated that they had to sell their skating rink at auction. What happened was a clerk in the office in the city of Rutland misregistered the collateral that they had put up to get their loan to do this thing. And they were putting in the finest steam heating system that you could get at the time. And that steam heating company was like, they smelled problems. And so they slapped a lien on the place right away. And the wheelmen couldn't gather enough money to sort of get their way out of that thing, and so they had to resign themselves to putting it up for auction. Within 10 years, it's basically torn down. It was a manufacturing facility for a little time. But as I said, they were so devastated that their last hurrah was in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1885. They rode there, and then they just were like, we're done. We're not going to do this stuff anymore. And so some of those wheelmen might have done stuff on their own, but the club disappeared. What about Manchester? Well, I know there are people in this room who know a lot more about this than I do, but I've picked up little tidbits about this area, and I'm always open, eager to know more. But the Historical Society has a few images. Here's O.G. Felt and Son with their bike and dog, and Orvis, ever attentive to the trends out there. Orvis was early on, as well as their fishing tackle. They were selling Spalding and Waverly bicycles, which were very good bicycles. There was a wheel club in the area, the Dorset Wheel Club, or I should say the Union Wheel Club. They were founded in 1895, and this was the Bennington semi-weekly banner announcing their formation. The goal was to promote the interests of cycling and good fellowship in general. And one of their first moves was to make preparations necessary for the largest and best conducted bicycle meets ever held in this part of the state. And there was a little flurry of articles about those bicycle meets, and it all ends. Like it just gets quiet. And so I don't know, the the Union Wheel Club, how far they went. How long did they last? My guess is that they were around for a few years, and everyone kind of eventually went their own way. Down the road in Bennington, there was a manufacturer of bicycles. Vermont didn't have too many manufacturers of bicycles, but the Bennington Bicycle Company created two models, the Tiffany Special and the Nelson Special. You can see a head badge there. This is in around 1895, 6, 7. I saw a Nelson Special show up on eBay about 5 years ago, and it just blew me away. I couldn't believe it. It was rusted to heck, so I didn't put them in my account. But these things still exist. They circulate out there. There was the Howe Bicycle Company in Rutland was also producing bikes, and then Coolidge Bicycle Company. They became Coolidge Motorworks. They had a couple of bicycles that they manufactured as well. So wheelmen were all about promoting orderly riding, and there were often in the newspapers a lot of advice columns about riding a bicycle. So here's one: always keep to the right, always keep your wheel clean. In passing another rider or vehicle, keep to the right. Keep off crowded streets unless you have urgent business there. Don't forget that pedestrians have rights. It often saves bitter flats. Yes, it is. And then this fascinates me from an anthropological perspective. There was a lot of discussion about this as a disruptive technology, right? We have our own disruptive technologies today. But this was very much a disruptive technology, and people were trying to make sense of what are the new norms for behavior and interaction around it. So this is a little tidbit from the United Opinion in Bradford in 1895, and it's titled Cycling Etiquette. Every sport has its rules of etiquette, and a system of exchange of courtesies must be adapted to cycling conditions. A question that is causing a great deal of agitation relates to the mode of greeting among wheelmen and wheelwomen. Shall a man take his hand from the handlebar at the risk of taking a header in order to tip his cap? Or shall he merely nod his head and say howdy? Shall a lady make a sweeping courtesy or merely nod? Instances are cited wherein men have tried to do that which they have been taught from childhood, and the result has been a hectic flush all over one side of their faces, where their skin was caressed by the loving but somewhat calloused hand of mother earth. Ladies who have vowed to profoundly have been picked up tenderly by helping hands after it was all over. It is with reason, therefore, that cyclists are giving this matter serious consideration. Wheelmen were also obsessed with racing, and the clubs were always organizing races. This is a report of a 1897 race from Bellows Falls to Claremont and back. It was sponsored by the Mount Kilburn Wheelmen. And what I love, there's this sentence in here that says, a good share of the village showed up accidentally. But this was a 40-mile bike ride, and the winner came back in 2 hours and 9 minutes, which averages out to 20 miles per hour. So if you know that country, it's hilly, and these are bad roads. This is, and these are bicycles that were probably, didn't have gears. They probably had brakes. But this remarkable feats of speed happened. People rode fast, and we kind of pat ourselves on our back for our pro and biker bikes and how fast we can go, which we can. But they were doing some really remarkable things. much heavier bikes with much fewer technological gadgets to make them go fast. And this describes a mishap here at the end that I'll share with you. When at the top of Dean Hill, about 5 miles this side of Claremont on a return trip, Henry Grignon broke the rim to one of his wheels and rode 2 miles farther before meeting his cousin with whom he exchanged wheels. He then rode on to Charlestown, where he secured another mount and arrived third in the race in spite of the mishap. And wheelmen often sought to, create these incredible experiences and feats of endurance. And this describes an 1894 trip by 2 crack Woodstock wheelmen who set out from Woodstock at 2:30 a.m., rode 83 miles to Littleton, New Hampshire. They got there, their idea was they were going to turn around, but they decided to keep going on to Woodsville, New Hampshire. And then they ended up spending the night somewhere up there. And in 23 hours, they rode 158 miles, took a short rest, and then the next morning, another 52 miles home. So this is newsworthy, right? This is really newsworthy stuff, because here's 2 young guys who were pushing their bodies and doing something really quite remarkable. But lurking out there is the scorching problem. So scorchers were the sort of other to the wheelman, the sort of dark side of the bicycle. And there was a lot of moral panic about scorching in our newspapers. This is an article from the 1899 Burlington Free Press, and it starts ominously. Another accident occurred Tuesday evening as a direct result of the ever-present bicycle scorcher. So bicycle scorchers were typically young men, often working class. They didn't have the class status to be able to join a wheelman's club, but they wanted to ride bikes, and they were seen as vaguely threatening because they're riding alone, they're not riding in orderly sort of fashion, they're going fast, and this article describes this situation where a guy named Abner Lozo, who was actually a mechanic at this bike shop. This was Lane Cycle Delivery on Main Street in Burlington. He was a mechanic there, and he was scorching in front of the bike shop there, and ran over Barney Buxton, a boy of 8 or 9 years old, who lay unconscious, cut on one side of the boy's head, right arm seriously bruised. They called Dr. Lyman. The lad regained consciousness, but was not able to remember anything about the accident. One day out of the blue, I got an email from someone who said, "Hey, I hear you do history of Burlington, do you know anything about my great-great-grandfather named Abner Lozo?" I was like, "Oh my gosh, Abner Lozo! I know one thing he did. He ran over Barney Buxton." So wheelmen tried to get out ahead of this. They were very aware that as more people were taking to the bicycle, their own authority to define what bicycle riding would be and how it would be done, they were losing grip on it. And so they started proposing regulations. And it's very interesting, the year 1897 and 1898, throughout the state of Vermont, you see bicycle ordinances popping up in all the towns. There had been sidewalk riding bans for quite a while, but in this case, it was the wheelmen themselves were trying to get out in front and say, look, we need to have regulations. So this is from the Mount Kilburn Wheel Club in Bellows Falls riding here. There's been considerable complaint of fast and reckless riding. It is better that the wheelmen take the matter in hand themselves. And as you read on, they say, we suggest all wheelmen carry lanterns and bells and keep to the right side of the street or on such bicycle paths as may hereafter be provided. And so this is why towns react. They say, let's get bicycle ordinances. And what's interesting is those bicycle ordinances today are virtually identical to what they wrote then. In Burlington, for example, no riding on sidewalks in the inner fire district. You need to have lights on before dusk and after dusk and before dawn. There's a speed limit in the downtown core. There isn't anymore, but they did then. You were required to have a bell and a light right? So there was a real attempt, and so this is one of the ways in which the automobile sort of landed on efforts already in place to create traffic ordinances and laws and organize it better. But the other little tidbit here that I find really interesting is they refer to these bicycle paths as may hereafter be provided. So this is 1897, and this was an interesting moment in American history when people were reimagining sort of intertown travel using bicycles. And so there were efforts, not so much in Vermont, but in New York, the upper Midwest, to connect towns by bicycle paths. Some of them were toll paths, others weren't, but in Vermont, it never gained any steam. There was one bike path between St. Johnsbury and Lyndonville. But this was this idea that we're going to get around in the future by bike, so let's build dedicated infrastructure, i.e. bicycle paths, to make it happen. Okay, shifting gears. What about the New Woman? This is a wonderful little cartoon from the Londonderry Sifter in 1897. He, don't you think it rather risky to come so far alone on your wheel? She, hadn't thought of it, but if you feel timid, I'll see you home. So, as I was saying earlier, in the 1890s, women are taking to bicycles in large numbers, and it provoked a lot of outrage about unchaperoned freedom and their immodest attire, to which the prominent American women's rights activist Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, "The bicycle will inspire women with more courage, self-respect, and self-reliance, and will make the next generation more vigorous of mind and body. For feeble mothers do not produce great statesmen, scientists, and scholars." So the suffragists were closely aligned with the bicycle. They used it as a symbol of women's emancipation. The temperance movement, which was a close ally of the suffrage movement, also loved bicycles. As one Vermont newspaper said, your drunk husband cannot ride home from the bar on a bicycle. The temperance movement really loved bicycles. So there was this close association between the sort of construction of a new woman in the 1890s and bicycles. And the newspapers here in Vermont were pretty interested in this phenomenon. And so you get a lot of this sort of the woman in the wheel articles. The coming woman will be the woman whose mother rode a bicycle and thereby made her fit to be the mother of the coming woman, says Ida Trafford Bell. There are 8 million bachelors in the United States. Watch the reduction in numbers as soon as the bicycle world in bloomers is scattered over the land, says the American Woman. So the bloomers were these sort of, they're pants of sorts, but they're very loose, and they were part of this sort of attempt at success at women riders to create more comfortable, less restrictive clothing. And there was a lot of debate in Vermont about bloomers being sort of, men's pants, and how inappropriate that was for women to have them. But there was also a sort of a counter discourse to it too. There was a celebration of bloomers in our newspapers. And there was one funny story I saw once where a preacher in one town up in the Northeast Kingdom was complaining about bloomers and what a travesty it is for civilization and women riding around on bikes and bloomers. And a local newspaper wrote a commentary on that, basically saying if that preacher ever came to this town, he would be run out of town right away. Right? Because there was an admiration of these women who were getting around by bicycle. It did create certain questions of etiquette on these women who were increasingly getting involved in bicycling. This is a tip, some tips on selecting a cycle teacher from the Burlington Free Press in 1895. Most cycle depots will send up a man to teach any of their own customers, and many ladies have learned in this fashion. Personally, however, it seems to me that if one must clutch any male thing wildly by the neck and fall into his arms 10 or 20 times in the course of an afternoon, a relative or intimate friend is better than an unknown oily mechanic. And I should therefore counsel any girl who contemplates learning the safety emphasis here was on physical training for women. And the idea, one of the reasons that the bicycle was seen as so advantageous for women is that it was an opportunity for them to take control of their bodies and exercise their bodies, get out and get fresh air, you know, be with your friends because it's a social activity. And so the way, you know, the right of suffrage for the vote was very controversial at the time, even among women. So one of the ways that suffragists in this state they didn't want to associate too closely with the bicycle, interestingly enough. They would talk about the right of physical training, having greater access to, you know, physical activity. And so, you know, here's one version of that ambivalence. Miss Mayhew, do you believe in women's suffrage? Miss Jan said, well, I haven't quite come to that yet, but I ride a bicycle. So there was a separation that was happening here between women who didn't want to associate with the suffragist cause, but were really keen on riding bicycles. Some of them quite elite. The Wells family here, the women of the Wells family, that would be General William Wells, the hero of Gettysburg from Burlington. The Wells and Richardson Corporation, very successful manufacturer of pharmaceuticals in Burlington. They were very visible cyclists, but they were not suffragists. Right? And so there, you know, this is one of the interesting sort of puzzles, why the suffrage movement here was pretty low key on bicycles in ways that in New York or Massachusetts it was quite the opposite. And you know, this is a research project really for someone to take on, but there's some possible answers. You know, there was relatively easy access to divorce here in the state of Vermont. Women were gaining economic independence through tourism. They were often the ones collecting money from visitors on farms and selling food. There were high literacy rates. There was this very strong separation between women's sphere as being the domestic sphere and men's being the public sphere. But throughout Vermont, there was already this idea that this was the embodiment of American freedom. So, you know, some of these may have tampered some of that suffragist vigor for the bicycle, I don't know. But really what consumed people was the health debate and its influences for women. So there was one side that said the best RX is a ride, take it instead of going to the druggist. And this was all called bicycling hygiene. Hygiene was this sort of sanitary living, a new concept at this time. And so bicycling hygiene was described in the Burlington Free Press in 1895 as it opens up the pores, which should be treated with ablutions of water. You should know how to breathe. Breathing through the mouth can cause heart troubles. And be sure your mouth doesn't get parched. It can affect digestion. Drink milk with a few drops of rum in it before a ride. And that rum thing is interesting. It's pervasive. Like the idea was that you should drink some rum before you ride a bicycle. So that's one side of this debate, but there was another side of this debate. This is a really remarkable article from the Burlington Free Press in 1895, and it's called Bicycle Riding Denounced. And these are the words of Dr. Heine Marks, who was the ex-superintendent of the city hospital in St. Louis. And he describes the effects of bicycling on people's bodies. First, you have a kind of paralysis of the hands. They did call that bicycle hands. And you know, you felt that, right? That tingliness and all that. They call that bicycle hands. And contraction of the chest. This causes congestion of the lungs and leads to consumption. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, but that's tuberculosis. I don't know how bicycle riding leads to tuberculosis. But furthermore, with men, rupture, varicocele, hydrocele follow, and worst of all, it destroys virility. With women, riding promotes amorous desires. Married women are especially liable to very serious mishaps. If the world is not depopulated by the rapidly increasing membership of the suicide club, the human race will die out by reason of lack of manhood and inability to fight. So there was a lot of this was being targeted at women, right? There was a particular malady called bicycle foot. references to it in the Vermont newspapers. And it was, it was like your ligaments of your foot somehow collapsing from riding a bicycle. But here's the thing, it was riding a bicycle in fashionable French boots. So it was really targeted at women, sort of, again, just like bicycle face was, right? So women were being called out. I think most Vermont women were sort of like, yeah, those are extreme claims, and there's, we're still going to ride our bicycles. But there was a UVM researcher, this was quite a delight for me to find, a guy named Graham Hammond, who was a professor of nervous disorders. I don't think we have that anymore. But he studied the bicycle and its effects on women's bodies. And it's a book, it's a full book, and he concludes that in moderation, the bicycle is the best thing possible for a woman's body. So, what about the roads? This is the last section, and Dan, you can see from that image the roads were miserable. We had, in the 1890s, about 13,000 miles of muddy and rutted dirt roads strewn with rocks and boulders. And mud season was absolutely horrific. And so the problem of roads was one that was central to the activity of bicycling from the very earliest days that you have bicycles. And figuring out how to have that nice, smooth road became a major concern of wheelmen. And remember, they're very influential, and they wanted to take on the way we managed and thought about roads and transform it to their benefit, but also they quickly found that farming and rural interests would benefit as well. And while farmers were a little reluctant, it was the sort of dairymen's associations and others in the state of Vermont that said, oh yes, good roads, we need good roads, we need to get our goods to market. Right, so, so the way we managed roads up to this point was, this farmer along this road here would be responsible for maintaining it, and oftentimes it would be pulling out stones and throwing them in, they get crunched down. And for a very long time, the way you paid your taxes to your town was to work on the road here in Vermont. And the state legislature set general guidelines. They said keep stones out of the road, make sure that the roads are a certain width. But it was the towns that controlled the roads, if not the individual landowners who were living proximally to it. Right? So it led to a lot of inconsistencies, road quality, and there was a thing called road science at the time. That's what they called it. And the road scientists were brought to Vermont by the Vermont Highway Commission in 1894, and they were aghast at what they found, which was, no attempt to really integrate the knowledge that was existing about good road building. And so the wheelmen really took it upon themselves to promote good roads politically. And in fact, in 1880, the League of American Wheelmen was formed in Providence, Newport, Rhode Island, at a meetup of wheelmen from all over the country, including Vermonters were there. And they wanted a national organization to promote the interests of wheelmen. And at the same moment that they sign off on creating this League of American Wheelmen, they create the Good Roads movement. And so they decided they needed to lobby for good roads. And but they took a while to get good roads. So what did they do? One thing that wheelmen did was they shared a lot of intel with each other. This is a really fun example of how they did it. This is a book from 1887 called 10,000 Miles on a Bicycle by a guy who goes by the nom de plume of Carl Crone. His real name is Lyman Bagg, which I personally like Lyman Bagg better. I think it's a great name. But what he did was he rode 10,000 miles on a bicycle, and every time he would stop in a new town, he'd ask who the wheelmen were. And he would say, hey, wheelmen, if you give me $5, I will send you my finished book. And what I'm doing is recording the roads and their conditions along the way. So you will know good rides to take. And so this is it's like a 900-page book. And what's remarkable about it is it describes in great detail different roads all over this country and into Canada, but also it lists every subscriber who was a wheelman, and there were like 45 Vermonters who were subscribers to this. There were copies of it circulating in Vermont. But this little tidbit on Vermont is if you ever are sitting around with cyclists these days, you can ask them, and now you're going to know the answer. When was the first century ride in Vermont? The answer is right here. The longest days ride previously taken in Vermont was on July 9th, 83, by two Rutland boys, W. Eggleston and A.S. Marshall, 100 miles. Okay, July 9th, 1883. It's the middle of summer. The roads are pretty dry, but they're climbing mountains. They're on high wheelers, and this was not an easy thing to do. So, you know, you can imagine riding a century ride back then is very different than what it would have been today. But you can see details here. I've ridden from Bellows Falls to Montpelier and Burlington, and all the roads as a whole fair. From Bellows Falls to Windsor, 25 miles. I took the New Hampshire side of the Connecticut River and found some patches of sand. He talks about, you know, some fine stretches and some unrideable. So anyway, this is how you as a wheelman would get advice on where to go. And then there was a book that was published in 1895 called the Vermont Road Book, and it curated rides. It was the Vermont Wheelmen's Clubs. Got together, they said, what are the best rides in the state? And they created this fun little booklet, and you can go on the ride even today. There's a copy of it in the Vermont Historical Society archives. The bike industry was very invested in the Good Roads movement, and in fact, one of the major funders of the Good Roads movement was Colonel Albert Pope, who was the president of Columbia Bicycles, and he was constantly promoting good roads. You know, at some level it's self-interested, right? He wants to sell more bikes. But it was interesting how he frames this. He was not the only one to do it, but it was this idea that we Americans are not quite civilized yet because we have terrible roads. An eminent writer says, the road is that physical sign or symbol by which you will best understand any age or people. If they have no roads, they are savages. For the road is the creation of man and the type of civilized society. So Pope would do things like this. This was an essay competition for high school and college students, giving away 100 Columbia bicycles for the best essays on the subject of good roads in any of its various phases. So, and, you know, this was the road department of the Pope Manufacturing Company. So, you know, Columbia Bicycles and it has a road department. The other thing that, you know, wheelmen love to do, and we do a version of it today. In Burlington, we have a Halloween ride, right? The Halloween ride is not just fun, it's a statement that is, you know, somewhat intended to communicate to the rest of Burlington, hey, bikes are here, we have access to the roads. And so this was a good roads trip. There's this frog here with a statement about good roads, and so you would have wheelmen and wheelwomen who ride around and draw attention to others about the, you know, sad state of affairs on American roads. So they were very political, wheelmen, about this, and they were lobbying state officials. And Vermont has a unique place in American history as one of the very first states to change how it dealt with roads. In 1892, we passed the Vermont Highway Act, which began centralized control. It basically said that no more are we going to rely on the individual landowners to do this or the individual towns. They've done a pretty bad job, so let's centralize. And it's going to be, the way we're going to fund it is new property taxes would be collected by the state and then redistributed as aid back to towns. State aid, we still have state aid. So they invented that concept. And the town could also, were authorized to issue bonds. And a state highway commission was established. So we were one of the 6 states that did this very, very early on. Some states, Massachusetts and New Jersey, went a little bit farther than we did in terms of really making it more of a state concern. There's always a fear in Vermont history, political history, of if you take too much power away from the towns will rebel, and they will, and there was always a back and forth between central government. But this really spells the end of how we dealt with roads. And actually, I didn't put a picture of him in there, but the governor who signed this was Levi Fuller. And Levi Fuller was from Brattleboro. So remember Brattleboro, right? Brattleboro is the home of the Vermont Wheel Club. His brother-in-law was the president at one point of the Wheel Club. So you can imagine the cajoling and harassment that he would have been getting from his peers. As far as I know, Levi Fuller was not himself a cyclist. He was in manufacturing workers and so on. But I don't know him to be a recreational cyclist, maybe you do. But he was certainly being heavily pressured by his peers. Right? So he traveled the United States for a few years and was celebrated as the road governor. He was a celebrity that the road movement would trot out and at famous conferences and stuff. And he was widely admired nationally for getting this thing passed. By 1900, we really do see the car beginning to eat away at the bicycle's distinctiveness. The first car to climb Mount Washington is 1899. The Vermont Motor Company is established in 1902. Horatio Nelson Jackson makes his famous bet to drive across the country in 1903. If you don't know that story, you should. It's super interesting. Horatio Nelson Jackson was a kind of wayward young doctor who was tired of being a physician. He was the son-in-law of William Wells, that general of Gettysburg. And he was out in San Francisco drinking beer with some buddies and made a bet, $50. I'm going to go out tomorrow and drive a car across the country. And he found a car, a little red roadster, and started his drive. It took him a couple of months, but he ended up making it to New York and collected on his $50. It was a horrendously difficult drive, but that was in 1903. Burlington Automobile Club was established in 1905, so these wheelmen, these former wheelmen, are now, they've completely abandoned the bicycle. And they're like, let's create a driving club. Right? So the Gentlemen's Driving Club is there. And in 1902, Burlington has its annual 4th of July parade, the military, automobile, bicycle roads, and trade parades, right? Automobiles. This is considered to be the first parade with automobiles in it. And of course, it has oracles. You don't know what oracles are. You should definitely know this. This is wonderful. It's a New England tradition that was born in the mid-1800s and spread up here to Vermont. It's basically a form of clowning. And so in these parades, people would dress up like local politicians and mock them and satirize them and embarrass them publicly. And I think we need to bring more of this back. And what really begins to shift after 1910 is the newspapers are filled not with the excitement of the bicycle, not with the exploits and the activities and the encounters, but the car versus bike discourse. That story launches very, very early, 1914, 1916, 1920. One of these articles starts with something like, the typical automobile-bicycle collision happened on Williston Road on Saturday night, right? So you see that idea really take off very early on. The bikes are in the way as and in 1920, I think we had about 30,000 cars in Vermont. So cars were still way outnumbered by bicycles. But really the game is completely shifting. And the bike is no longer seen as this sort of, tool of liberation. It's increasingly being put onto the car. And so this story really gets stuck very early. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you so much for hanging in there. There's a lot to share. I hope you enjoy it. And if you have any questions, I hope you have some time. Yeah.
I'm puzzled by how does a bicycle go onto an ice rink?
How does the bicycle go onto an ice
You
rink?
talked about ice skating. I assume you didn't roll.
No, it was actually roller skating.
Oh, I
Yeah.
wondered that.
Roller skating. Roller skating was super popular back
Yeah,
then.
yeah,
Yep. in Burlington, the Burlington Wheel Club in the 1880s, they bought an old grocery warehouse and turned it into a rink, a skate rink. It's now that, in fact, if you know Burlington, it's where the Fletcher Free Library is. It's right smack downtown, where they own their skating rink.
We don't know what happens when we're at Mike on Ice.
Which I do. I love riding on Mike and Ice. There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of the bicycle technology between the penny farthing era and the safety bike era? Now, I have some experience riding a fixed gear bike, and I can't imagine that the penny farthing wasn't a fixed gear bike. There was no free wheel, correct?
There were. They were rare, but yeah, there was incredible experimentation. There were gearing systems that were being created. There were some penny farthings had two cogs of sorts that were chained between them. I am not an expert in that.
So
You're an
what I
expert.
wonder is, could
You
you
can
go
tell
up
us.
and
You're
down
gonna have to stand
hills?
up and say.
Could you go up and down hills on the penny farthing? Does it only have
Well,
one gear?
yes and no. I mean, there was a sense in which people were walking a lot, right?
Yeah.
You knew that if you were out on a ride, the hill, when you got to the hill, people were going to walk up it. So attentiveness to shoes was a key part of this, like what kind of shoes are you going to wear?
And how do you mount and dismount a penny farthing?
So, let's see. I guess I don't really have a great picture. Let's see. I can point to it. In the back, we'll find Nellie Ross. Here we go. So, somewhere right over here is a little step. And what you'll do is you'll sort of have your hands up here and get it moving, and then you'll get on the step and roll, and then you kind of mount yourself and throw yourself up. You know? I've not done it too much, so I'm not sure. You've done it, right? It's hard.
They say too that if you were super cool, you actually ran along beside it and rode the pedal up and mounted it like you would a horse.
Wow.
So we have a lot of members who can get off that way. It's really rare to get on that way. It's really hard.
It must have been terrifying when you got going down the hill and had to get off of it.
You get off the top.
Yeah.
So you walk it up and you walk it down.
Well, the other thing that they would have sometimes, this one doesn't, but they would often have sort of little stirrups right here. And this is true on bone shakers, for example. Bone shakers often have stirrups, and you can just rest your legs up there. Just hope for the best.
What about the evolution of tires? You said in the beginning that there was wood with the iron rims and then maybe a little strip of rubber.
Yeah.
But like, what happened with the rubber trade? And you've mentioned Dr. Dunlop.
Yeah. So you know, these were glued onto the wood in the early years when you start seeing rubber, and it wasn't unknown to just fall off right? But by the time you get to these bikes, they've really, the rims are remarkable achievements of technology. These sort of spoke rims, and you know, they still had to glue them, but the glues were improved. That pneumatic tire that Dunlop sort of invents, and then it clearly is superior. It makes the bike softer. Then you find a real shift. You don't see the solid rubber anymore. People, in fact, what was the term? There was a funny term that you see circulating around. A century. So a century in the 1890s referred to not simply a 100-mile ride. It referred to someone from the high wheeler era who still rode a high wheeler. Because why would you, right? Like it's safe, it's comfortable, you know, they're bumpy, you know, and we've got these safety bicycles with tires that you're floating on air, right? So, someone who was a century was an old timer, a fogey in the 1890s who was still riding on those high wheels. So, but yeah, the burgeoning accessories business for bicycles. So it wasn't just the great technological achievements of the companies manufacturing bicycles themselves. It was these sort of side businesses that were popping up all over to improve and refine elements of the bicycle and all of the accoutrements that went along with it, the shoes, the gloves, the squirt guns for dogs,
What?
the medals, you know. Oh yeah, people carry those squirt guns for dogs. And whistles, yes,
Seats.
horns. Yeah. Any other questions? Fun. Yeah.
Just thinking about how unique is the narrative to Vermont, and if you had to zoom out,
Yeah.
how would you compare and contrast either common themes across regions like the North and South, Midwest? If
That's
there-
a really
there are
great,
any.
I love that question, right? That we're in a room full of Vermonters, we love Vermont exceptionalism, right? Like Vermont is this really special place. And in some ways, in this story, Vermont plays a special role. That road issue is one, for sure, hands down. We're one of the first states to really take this issue seriously and make progress on it. And throughout the early 20th century, leaders in Vermont would refer to that as we took leadership on this road issue in this state. But what's so interesting is our geographic position is unique that pretty much immediately, the real epicenters of cycling were in Boston and New York, up north in Montreal, and people were going from Boston to Montreal. They were coming up from New York. And this map right here, if you get a chance to look at it, this is an 1894 bike map for the southern part of Vermont. It has Manchester. You can see this is a crossroads for wheelmen to come. But they were coming up a lot through Brattleboro. And what's so interesting about Brattleboro, and one reason why the Vermont Wheel Club gained a kind of prominence, is that you've got all these people coming in from Point South up into the state through there. And that economic world of Brattleboro is totally tied to that manufacturing corridor along the Connecticut River south of there, Hartford, Northampton, Mass, Chicopee Falls, Massachusetts, where all the bikes were being made. So there was this really interesting way in which Vermont was just sort of on the edge, and so it got the flow of excitement and energy. And really, by the mid-1890s, what government officials here are concerning themselves with around the road question is we need to make this better, if not for us, then for tourists, because we want to keep these people coming in. They're part of our economy now. And so I think it's our proximity to that Connecticut River Valley plays a big role. The fact that wheelmen are passing through, they're stopping and spending the night in hotels and wheelmen's clubs. So you just didn't see this in other states, right? And so while we weren't manufacturing much here, we did have a lot of activity.
Now we're riding gravel bikes again.
Now we're riding gravel bikes again. I know, it's so funny. There's so many ways in which what they did anticipates and, some of the things that we think about and worry about.
There's nothing,
Yeah, that's right.
nothing in technological.
That's why I called my book Reconsidering the Bicycle from an Anthropological Perspective on a New Old Thing, right? There's so many ways in which the bicycle is sort of old thing that people have been working with and using to make social change for a long time.
Well, then there's the Wright brothers, right?
Yes, of course. Orville and Wilbur were bike mechanics, and so actually the last time I gave this talk a month ago, somebody had studied this very carefully, and I can't remember the details, I should have written it down, but he knew a lot about literally how they were translating bicycle technologies to their very first plane. Like they were taking things that they knew that would work on a bike, and they somehow changed it so that they could get it to fly. So there's a direct connection there. So that's another one that you sometimes hear, that the bike didn't just lay the groundwork for the automobile industry, but also for the airplanes.
How about the connection to the ski industry? The fact that tourism in Vermont started to be built around bicycle tourism, then the ski industry came along, which basically altered Vermont
Yeah.
ways of doing business to cater to ski tourism.
Yeah, that's an interesting connection. It's not one that I've been able to make super explicitly through my research, but these things are, you know, back in the 1940s and 50s, for example, when the ski industry is really beginning to take shape, you do see a lot of bike tourism in Vermont. And it's Vermonters, young Vermonters wanting to travel around the state. It's people still coming up. But it's really, it's not invisible, but it's pretty low profile, right? That was not a time, bicycles were kids' toys in the 50s and 40s, right? So it was, they were riding on old Columbias and, you know, bikes that didn't draw a whole lot of attention, but they were there. I've seen this in the Vermont Historical Society archives. There's some really great diaries of Vermonters who were touring by bike around the state in the 40s and 50s. So you got to wonder, like, what is that connection?
We've got Vermont Bicycle Touring, which.
Yeah, they started
was
early.
one of the first
Yeah.
bicycle touring, and it's all over.
They started early.
Oh, now.
Yeah. And they're coming back and rediscovering gravel bikes in Vermont.
So, I grew up in Southern California, and I
Oh,
still
so
go
did
there
I.
and visit.
I did too. I'm from San Diego.
I'm from Beach. But, so I go out there and I ride, I have a 55 Schwinn.
Oh, wow.
It's basically set up as it was.
Yeah.
But, so I was riding it one day and I ran into a guy who was a member of a classic bicycle club. And apparently out there, people get together and go on group rides where there's this whole energy about how old and how authentic and how original are the components on. He had like an original license plate from a 1939, you know, something. A lot of energy around that too.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
there anything like that here where?
Well, this is where I step aside from the podium and invite leaders of the Wheelmen to come up, because yes, there is a huge culture around this era. The Wheelmen is one club that does this. It's a national level club, and I mean, I don't want to talk for you. You really do need to say something. It's like this is like your territory. But I would just, before you say something, there's so many periods of bicycling history that you see this, right? I've become aware. I restored a 1982 Guerciati racing bike, for like Tour de France, right? And I discovered there's a world of vintage road riding trips that you can go on and rallies and so on. That you have to have that right kind of era bike to do 75 to 83 or something.
And you wear the clothes.
And you wear the clothes and the shoes and all of that. But I think, could you say a word about the Wheelmen and sort of how, what it is?
Yeah, so the Wheelman, oh, do I have to stand up? Do I have to stand up? So the Wheelman is actually, it's mostly an American, but it is an international bicycle club. We started in 1965, 6, dedicated to really the Victorian era of cycling. We just recently voted to expand up to bicycles 1937 or earlier. That's our focus. Primarily, our riders ride high-low bikes for safeties. Like my bike is an 1898, ladies. It's a totally tricked out Ben-Hur safety. Malcolm rides a Star. He used to ride an ordinary. But then there are lots of groups. Like Vermont has a group that's really dedicated to 40s and 50s bikes, and they do a tweed ride where the only prerequisite is you ride something older than you. So I like to say one of my modern bikes is a 56 Schwinn Debutant, which I've done a couple quarter centuries on. But the Wheelman is, we do a lot of history of cycling, we have a lot of members who have gotten deeply into the machining, so there's a lot of restoration work, everything, but it's really cool when you look at cycling, pretty much every era in cycling, you'll find a group that is dedicated to that era. And it's like, there's a wonderful, if you have an opportunity, a wonderful annual bicycle auction in Copic, New York. And it's back in business. They were down for COVID, but my auction, the catalog, which is coming up soon. And depending on whose collection or what the focus is, 2 years ago, it was all 70s road bikes. There must have been 400 70s road bikes and wool jerseys. So the 70s group, which you would think, you know, most of us grew up with those bikes. You know, we kind of destroyed those bikes, but there's like this massive group of people who are really dedicated, as dedicated to those bikes as the tank group, the tank bike guys are, and the Schwinn Stingray groups are. So it's a very cool thing. Even if you don't get to Copic, it's really worth checking their online catalog just for the fun of it. So
What was interesting about these guys is, so my Schwinn is rehabilitated. So it's repainted, but it's repainted exactly like the original paint job. But like they looked at it and went, man, that's not like, you'd be better off if it was original and all rusty, right?
every group has them in Southern California. Even in our club, Southern California is famous.
But they pass people and literally, they turn around like this. Along the beach, there's this long bike path that goes from Newport Beach all the way back up to Sea Beach. So it's like, 25 miles one way. And people will turn around and come and chase you down to pull you over and talk to you about your bike.
That's pretty cool. Yeah,
And I didn't know anything about this. I was just out there riding. It was really fun.
that's pretty cool.
Well, I'm going to close this. I'm sure you have, do you have something?
I have one
Yes,
question.
of course.
So I'm just that roller rink in Rutland. Do you have a feel for where that was?
It was on Church Street in Rutland. And one of the arguments that I saw in the newspaper about why it failed is that its Church Street location, it didn't give an address, but it said its Church Street location was a little bit too far out from the center to attract people. So,
That's too bad.
yeah, you can imagine if it somehow survived. Well, thank you all very, very much.